In this video, we're going to go ahead and set up an AVD. Now that's an Android virtual device. And what that allows you to do is run an Android app on your computer. Now the reason you'd want to do that is for testing purposes. In the case that you want to quickly test your app to make sure that it's working correctly, but also if you haven't got an Android device. So an AVD is a very handy device to set up on your computer for testing purposes. Now, just a reminder, this is the Mac version. So if you're running Windows, please refer to the separate section on the Windows setup. Okay, let's proceed. Okay, I'm back in my developer folder and I'm going to go and open Eclipse. So I'm going to go into the ADT Bundle Mac folder, into the Eclipse folder, and I'm going to go and start Eclipse by double clicking it. And click OK. And I'm going to go into the SDK Manager once Eclipse is loaded. Click on Window, Android SDK Manager. Now before we set up our Android virtual device, what is highly recommended that you do, and what I'm going to do, is install a piece of software by Intel, and it's basically called the Intel Hardware Accelerated Execution Manager. And it's this little option down here down the bottom. Now what that enables you to do is get a dramatic speed increase when you're using your Android emulator. The thing is, because the computer is emulating an Android device, it's usually much slower. And in this case, I can completely confirm that it is very, very slow generally. These things don't update their screen very quick and they take a long time to load up and it's almost unusable. But the great thing is that with this piece of free software from Intel, the speed is dramatically sped up. And the reason that it's sped up is that the software connects the software through to your graphics card in your computer. So consequently, the drawing of the Android app is using your graphics card. So it's something we definitely want to install. Installing it's pretty straightforward, but we'll go through that process now first before we configure our Android virtual device. So to do that, I'm going to make sure nothing else is selected and click on here under the Intel x86 Emulator Accelerator. And I'm just going to install that one package. I'm going to accept the license agreement by clicking on it and then clicking on Accept License and click Install. Now, unlike the other installs in the previous video that also downloaded and installed, this one literally has only downloaded the file. So we now need to go into the folder to install that on our computer. But that's quite a straightforward process to do, and you can notice it says it's installed now. Technically that's not right. Technically it has only downloaded it. So I'm going to show you how to do that. We'll close down the Android SDK Manager and we'll close down Eclipse for the time being. And this time we want to go back to our developer folder, into our Android Developer Tool Bundle folder. But this time, instead of the Eclipse folder, we want to go into the SDK Manager. Then we want to double click the Extras folder, double click into the Intel folder, and finally double click into the Hardware Accelerated Execution Manager folder. Now you'll notice there's two files there, the Intel Haxum, the version that is for below the version of 10.10. Now when they say 10.10, they're referring to the version of the Mac OS X operating system. So in my case, I can click on the Apple menu in the top left hand corner and click on About. You'll see that I'm running version 10.9.5. So do check what version you're running. In my case, because I'm below 10.10, I'm going to be running that one. But if you're running 10.10, which is the very latest version, Yosemite, you'd click that option. So in my case, because I'm running 10.9, I'm going to double click the below 10.10 and we're going to install this as we would normally install a package. Okay, click on Continue. Now it'll come up with a default allocation of how much memory to allocate. I suggest you probably leave it as the default. Now in the case of my iMac, I've got 32 gigs of RAM and it wants to allocate 2 gigabytes. So if it's going to be looking at taking half your memory, you might want to really reduce it, but probably you'll find that it will automatically allocate the reasonable amount so it doesn't sort of tax and overload your computer. So in other words, just accept the default, click on Continue. And it confirms in this case it's going to use 2 gigabytes of system memory. Click on Continue, click on Install, type in your password, and we'll let that finish installing. Now once this is installed, we can go back into Eclipse and we can set up our Android virtual device. Now it will come up with this error. That's just basically the Mac coming up and giving you a warning and saying, look, it doesn't recognize where this kernel extension is from. We don't need to worry about this particular error message in this case, or this warning. That's because we've downloaded the software using an official sort of Android SDK manager, so we know that this is a legitimate piece of software. So I'm going to click on OK, and we can see that the installation has completed or was completed successfully. I'm going to close that down, inject that, and now we can go back again to our developer folder, Android developer tools folder, and go back into the Eclipse folder and start Eclipse again. Now that we've installed that, we can go ahead and set up our Android virtual device. Now, the way we do that once Eclipse is loaded is we just click on Window. I go down here to Android Virtual Device Manager. Okay, once that's loaded, you can see it says there's no Android virtual devices, AVDs, available. So we're going to configure one. So to do that, we're going to go into Device Definitions. Okay, so you've got a list of options, and these essentially are all the different types of emulators, or the different type of Android devices, I should say, that we can emulate on our computer. For the purposes of this course, and due to the amount of real estate that I've got on my screen, I'm going to choose the Nexus 4. But if you've got a large enough screen, you can certainly go for a Nexus 10 or a Nexus 5 or a Nexus 7, something along those lines. Look, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure you select a relatively new model that's sort of not really old or anything of that nature. In this case, Nexus 4 is going to suit our purposes fine. I'm going to click Create AVD. Now that brings this screen up for us, and we can type in a name. I'm just going to leave the default name there, but you can change it to something if you want. And the other thing now we go to is Target, and we need to select what version of the API we want this virtual device to be running. So we're going to select the Android 5.0 API level 21. Now the next thing is the CPU. We've got two options, and because of Android level 21, we've now got a 64-bit option. We're just going to select just the 32-bit, which is the standard version for now, but you could potentially use either. For the skin, we're just going to go with a default option, skin with dynamic hardware controls, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. Now these memory options, you can probably leave as the default settings. You don't really need to change anything there. And these are just all to do with how much RAM is going to be allocated for this device when it's running. Now obviously if you allocated too small an amount of RAM, there would be a problem running the device and it may not even start. I just normally just accept whatever the defaults are, and they seem to work quite well. And then the other important thing is down here is to make sure you click Use Host GPU. Now by clicking that button, we're going to be using that Intel Hexam software that we installed just a minute ago. It's going to be using that when we're running the emulator. Now if you find that your emulator is really slow and it takes like minutes to start, probably what's happened is you haven't clicked that button. So I'm going to click on OK. Okay, you can see that's now set up the device. I'll just give that a bit more room so we can see what we're reading here. And you can see it's set that up. So that's now going to be stored permanently. It's given you a look at the folder where that's stored. And we can start this whenever we want. So I'm going to start that now just to show you what it looks like. And then in a future video, we'll actually start using it. Click on Start. Now, really, when the screen comes up, you don't really need to do anything. The only real thing to talk about is this wipe user data. Now, if you've been using an Android virtual device for a while and you've loaded a lot of programs on it, or maybe there's some sort of problem with it, by clicking on the wipe user data option, you can clean it out, effectively like reformatting it or taking it back to its default state. Normally I leave that unticked, and especially in this case, because this is the first time we've launched it, we don't need to do that. So I'm going to click on Launch. Now that's now starting the emulator, and what we want to look for on the screen is hopefully it'll come up with a message saying that the HAX software has actually started. You can see down the bottom, you may have just caught that briefly, it said HAX was loading, so that gives us a good indication. And you can see now loading on the screen, so I'll put that into the middle, we've got our Android virtual device, and that's effectively booting up now. And bearing in mind, this is the official Android 5 system image, if you like. This would be the same software that someone would have on their device. It's running on our computer, and you can see that it's booted up now. And for all intensive purposes, this is actually a real Android device. Now we can use it using our mouse. We can swipe. And we've got full access to just the regular Android functionality. We can click on here for a list of apps. Let's close that. It's coming up with some help because it's the first time we've used it. And we can just use our mouse to swipe left and right as we would normally do. So we've actually got a real device now here that we can actually use, and we can deploy our apps to this device for testing purposes. So you can see how this would be very handy, for testing purposes, because you can actually leave it running on your computer. And as I'll show you in a future video, you'll be able to run the applications directly on this device. And pretty well the only other thing we need to talk about is how to close it down. And that's really quite easy. We just go over here to this little power button and hold it down, left mouse button down, and click on power off. If you just click it and let it go, it'll come up with a menu option, but because I held it down, it automatically shut down. So we'll leave that to shut down. Okay, so that's closed now. Now, the only other thing I want to point out here is now that we've created this device, you can create additional devices by going back here into device definitions again and then choosing the appropriate device and clicking on create if you want to. But if we go back to the Android Virtual Devices tab, we can also delete this. So if you did find that there was a problem with the setup, or you got an option wrong, or for whatever reason it wasn't working, you can literally just click on that and you can click on delete, and you can delete it if you want. So you really can't do much damage here. It's just a matter of going through that process, and you've got yourself an Android virtual device. All right, let's move on to the next video.